What happens when love turns deadly on a snow-covered night, and the person closest to the victim becomes the prime suspect in a case that would divide an entire community? The bitter cold of January 29, 2022, in Millbrook, Connecticut, was the kind that cuts through winter coats and chills you to the bone. But for Detective Thomas Brennan of the Millbrook Police Department, nothing could have prepared him for what he would discover that morning. A scene that would launch one of the most controversial and emotionally charged murder investigations in the state's history. The call came in at 6:04 a.m. A woman's voice, shaking with what sounded like panic and disbelief, reported finding her boyfriend unconscious in the snow outside a house on Maple Ridge Drive. The caller identified herself as Melody Sinclair, 44, a financial analyst who lived just 3 miles away from the scene. "He's not moving," Melody's voice cracked through the 911 dispatcher's headset. "There's blood. Oh God, there's so much blood. I think he might be dead."
Real quick, stats show that about 95% of viewers watching our videos aren't subscribed yet. If you're enjoying this story, take a second to subscribe. It helps the channel grow and brings more stories like this to you and others who need them. Let's keep going.
When first responders arrived at 412 Maple Ridge Drive, they found Detective Lieutenant Michael Castellano, 46, a beloved 16-year veteran of the Millbrook Police Department, lying motionless in a snowbank near the front yard. His body was partially covered by the overnight snowfall, and the scene was haunting. A decorated officer reduced to a frozen figure against the pristine white landscape. Castellano had dedicated his life to serving his community. Known for his infectious laugh and unwavering dedication to justice, he had worked his way up through the ranks, earning the respect of colleagues and the admiration of countless citizens whose lives he had touched. He was the kind of officer who would stop to help change a tire in the rain, who remembered the names of every victim he had helped, and who had mentored dozens of young officers throughout his career. The irony was not lost on anyone present that morning. Here was a man who had spent his career investigating crime scenes, now lying at the center of one himself. Melody Sinclair and Michael Castellano had been dating for nearly 2 years. Friends described their relationship as passionate but turbulent, marked by deep affection shadowed by Melody's struggles with alcohol. Those close to the couple knew that Melody had been battling addiction issues, often turning to drinking as a way to cope with stress and emotional pain. Despite these challenges, Michael had stood by Melody, believing in her capacity for change and supporting her through multiple attempts at sobriety. His friends worried about the relationship, but Michael was known for his loyalty and his belief that love could conquer all obstacles. The night of January 28th had started like many others. Melody and Michael had gone out for dinner at Riverside Tavern, a local establishment known for its craft cocktails and warm atmosphere. Surveillance footage would later show them arriving at 7:30 p.m., appearing relaxed and happy. They had planned to attend a small gathering afterward at the home of Detective Sergeant Robert Hartwell, a colleague and friend of Michael's. What happened next would become the central question in a case that would consume the community for years to come. According to Melody's initial statements to police, the evening had started well. She and Michael had enjoyed dinner, though she admitted to having several drinks throughout the night. After dinner, they drove to Hartwell's house on Maple Ridge Drive, where a small group of off-duty officers and their partners had gathered for drinks and conversation. But Melody's account of the evening contained troubling gaps and inconsistencies that would later become crucial to the investigation. She claimed they had arrived at Hartwell's house around 10:30 p.m., but she couldn't clearly remember much of what happened next. She said she remembered being in the car with Michael, but couldn't recall actually going inside the house. "I was drinking," she would later tell investigators, tears streaming down her face. "I know I was drinking too much, but I would never hurt Michael. I loved him." The last clear memory Melody claimed to have was of driving home alone, without Michael, sometime after midnight. She said she assumed he had decided to stay at the party and would catch a ride home later or call her in the morning. It wasn't until she woke up around 5:30 a.m. and realized Michael hadn't come home that she began to worry. Driven by concern and a growing sense of dread, Melody had returned to Hartwell's house to look for Michael. That's when she found him in the snow, and her world collapsed. Detective Patricia Reeves was assigned as the lead investigator on the case. A 20-year veteran with a reputation for thoroughness and attention to detail, Reeves approached the scene with the methodical precision that had made her one of the department's most respected detectives. The initial examination of the scene raised immediate questions. Michael's body showed signs of significant trauma, injuries consistent with being struck by a vehicle. The snow around his body was disturbed, and there were tire tracks leading away from the scene. Most significantly, investigators discovered fragments of red plastic near the body, pieces that appeared to be from a vehicle's taillight. When investigators examined Melody's black Lexus SUV, they found significant damage to the passenger side taillight. The light was completely shattered, and pieces were missing, pieces that appeared to match the fragments found at the scene. Additionally, there was damage to the vehicle's front bumper and evidence of what appeared to be biological material. The physical evidence seemed to tell a clear story. Melody had struck Michael with her vehicle and left him to die in the freezing cold. But as Detective Reeves dug deeper, the case became increasingly complex. The initial autopsy revealed that while Michael had suffered severe trauma consistent with being struck by a vehicle, there were also other injuries that seemed harder to explain. Injuries that suggested possible blunt force trauma that might not have come from a vehicle impact. As news of the investigation spread, the tight-knit community of Millbrook found itself deeply divided. Michael Castellano had been a pillar of the community, and his death sent shockwaves through the town. The local newspaper ran daily stories about the case, and soon national media outlets picked up the story. On one side were those who believed the evidence was clear. Melody Sinclair had killed her boyfriend in an alcohol-fueled rage and should face the full consequences of her actions. Michael's family, led by his sister Patricia Castellano Murphy, became vocal advocates for justice, organizing vigils and speaking out about the devastating impact of his loss. "Michael was everything to our family," Patricia said at one of the vigils, her voice breaking with emotion. "He was the person we all turned to when we needed help, when we needed strength. He didn't deserve to die alone in the cold like that. He deserved better, and we're going to fight for him." On the other side, however, a growing number of people began to question the official narrative. Melody's defense attorney, Thomas Brennan, a former prosecutor known for taking on controversial cases, began raising questions about the investigation itself. He argued that his client was being railroaded by a police department more interested in protecting its own than in finding the truth. As the case developed, Brennan's defense strategy became increasingly bold and controversial. He argued that Melody was not the killer, but rather the victim of an elaborate cover-up orchestrated by members of the police department to protect the real perpetrator. According to Brennan's theory, something had happened inside Hartwell's house that night, something that had resulted in Michael's death. He suggested that Michael had been killed inside the house, possibly during a fight or confrontation, and that his body had been moved outside to make it appear as though he had been struck by a vehicle. The defense pointed to several troubling aspects of the investigation. First, the crime scene had not been properly secured. Multiple people had walked through the area before forensic specialists arrived, potentially contaminating evidence. Second, key pieces of evidence had been mishandled or destroyed, including Michael's clothing and items from his cell phone. Third, several of the witnesses had given inconsistent statements about what had happened that night. Most damning of all, Brennan argued, was the fact that Detective Sergeant Robert Hartwell, the host of the party, had sold his house and moved out of state just weeks after the incident, before he could be thoroughly questioned about what had happened inside his home that night. "They're using Melody as a scapegoat," Brennan argued passionately in court. "She's an easy target, a woman with a drinking problem who can't remember everything that happened that night. But the Retrial killers are walking free, protected by their badges and their brotherhood." As the investigation continued, both sides marshaled evidence to support their theories. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Margaret Collins, built a case based on the physical evidence and Melody's own admissions about her drinking that night. The state's case included the damaged taillight on Melody's vehicle and the matching fragments found at the scene, biological evidence on her car that was consistent with having struck a person, Melody's own admissions about her heavy drinking and inability to remember key parts of the evening, cell phone evidence showing that Melody had made several calls and sent texts expressing anger and frustration in the hours before Michael's death, witness testimony about the couple's troubled relationship and previous incidents involving Melody's drinking. The prosecution argued that Melody had struck Michael with her vehicle, either intentionally in a fit of rage or accidentally due to her impaired state, and then left him to die in the cold rather than call for help. But the defense countered with its own evidence. Medical testimony suggesting that some of Michael's injuries were inconsistent with being struck by a vehicle. questions about the timeline of events and the reliability of witness statements. Evidence that key witnesses had given conflicting accounts of what happened that night. Documentation of the mishandling of evidence by investigators. Expert testimony about the effects of alcohol on memory and the unreliability of statements made by intoxicated individuals. When the case finally went to trial, it became a media sensation. The courtroom was packed daily with supporters of both Michael's family and Melody's defense team. Outside, protesters held signs demanding justice for Michael, while others proclaimed Melody's innocence and called for a real investigation into what they saw as a police cover-up. The trial was emotionally charged from the beginning. Patricia Castellano Murphy delivered a victim impact statement that left few dry eyes in the courtroom. She spoke about Michael's dedication to his family, his service to the community, and the devastating impact of his death on everyone who loved him. Michael was more than just a police officer, she said, her voice steady despite her tears. He was a son, a brother, an uncle, a friend. He was the person who would drive through a snowstorm to check on elderly neighbors. He was the officer who would spend his own money to buy groceries for families in need. He was the man who believed in justice, who believed in doing the right thing no matter how difficult it was. The prosecution presented their case methodically, walking the jury through the physical evidence and building a timeline of events that they argued clearly showed Melody's guilt. They brought in expert witnesses to testify about the damage to her vehicle and the biological evidence found on it. They presented evidence of her drinking that night and her inability to provide a coherent account of what had happened. But the defense was equally prepared. Brennan challenged every piece of evidence, questioning the chain of custody, the reliability of testing procedures, and the motivations of the investigators. He presented alternative theories about what might have happened that night, always returning to his central theme: that Melody was being framed by a police department more interested in protecting its own than in finding the truth. The testimony of Melody herself became one of the most dramatic moments of the trial. Taking the stand in her own defense, she broke down repeatedly as she described her love for Michael and her horror at discovering his body that morning. "I know I was drinking that night," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I know I made mistakes, but I would never, ever hurt Michael. I loved him more than anything in this world. The idea that I could have killed him and then just left him there to die. It's not possible. It's not who I am." After 5 days of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict that stunned the courtroom and the community. They found Melody not guilty of murder, not guilty of manslaughter, and not guilty of leaving the scene of an accident resulting in death. However, they did find her guilty of operating a vehicle under the influence of alcohol. The verdict sent shockwaves through the community. Michael's family was devastated, feeling that justice had not been served. Patricia Castellano Murphy collapsed in tears, supported by family members who shared her grief and frustration. "This is not justice for Michael," she said outside the courthouse. "This is not what he would have wanted. He believed in the system, he believed in the law, and today that system failed him." But for Melody and her supporters, the verdict was vindication. They saw it as proof that she had been wrongly accused and that the Retrial killers had never been brought to justice. In the months following the trial, the case continued to generate controversy and debate. Michael's family filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Melody, seeking to hold her accountable in civil court for what they believed was her role in his death. The lawsuit included claims against the bars where Melody had been drinking that night, arguing that they had overserved her alcohol. Meanwhile, calls for a new investigation into Michael's death grew louder. Melody's supporters argued that the case had exposed serious flaws in the police investigation and that the Retrial killers had never been pursued. They pointed to the fact that no one else had ever been charged in connection with Michael's death, despite the defense's allegations of a cover-up. The case also raised broader questions about police accountability and the investigation of crimes involving law enforcement officers. Critics argued that the investigation had been compromised from the beginning by conflicts of interest and a desire to protect fellow officers. Detective Patricia Reeves, who had led the investigation, defended her work but acknowledged that the case had been challenging from the start. "We followed the evidence where it led us," she said in an interview after the trial. "We believed then, and we believe now, that we had the right person. The jury saw it differently, and we have to respect that." Behind all the legal maneuvering and media attention, the case had taken a devastating human toll. Michael's family struggled to come to terms with their loss and their belief that his killer had escaped justice. His nieces and nephews, who had looked up to him as a role model and father figure, were left to grow up without the man who had been such an important part of their lives. Melody, despite her acquittal on the major charges, faced ongoing civil litigation and the weight of public opinion that remained divided about her guilt or innocence. The case had cost her career, her reputation, and her peace of mind. She struggled with the knowledge that many people still believed she was responsible for Michael's death, even though a jury had found her not guilty. The case also affected the broader community of Millbrook. The police department faced scrutiny and criticism about its handling of the investigation. Several officers, including Detective Sergeant Robert Hartwell, left the department in the wake of the case. The community's faith in its law enforcement had been shaken, and the divisions created by the case continued to simmer long after the trial ended. The case of Michael Castellano's death and the trial of Melody Sinclair offers several important lessons about the criminal justice system, the nature of truth, and the complexity of human relationships. First, it demonstrates the challenges faced by investigators when dealing with cases involving alcohol, memory, and conflicting witness accounts. The fact that the key witness, Melody herself, had been drinking heavily and could not remember crucial details made it difficult to establish a clear timeline of events. This case highlights the importance of thorough, unbiased investigation and the need for investigators to consider all possible scenarios, even when the evidence seems to point in one direction. Second, the case illustrates the potential for conflicts of interest when police investigate crimes involving their own officers. Whether or not there was actually a cover-up, the perception of bias undermined public confidence in the investigation and contributed to the controversy surrounding the case. This suggests the need for independent oversight and investigation of cases involving law enforcement personnel. Third, the case shows how domestic violence and relationship issues can escalate into tragedy, particularly when alcohol is involved. While the jury ultimately found Melody not guilty of murder, the case serves as a reminder of the dangers of alcohol abuse and the importance of addressing relationship problems before they reach a crisis point. Finally, the case demonstrates the lasting impact of violent crime on families and communities. Regardless of the legal outcome, Michael Castellano's death left a permanent scar on his family and the community he served. The division and controversy surrounding the case only added to the pain experienced by those who loved him. More than 2 years after Michael Castellano's death, questions remain about what really happened that night in January 2022. The case has become a symbol of the broader challenges facing the criminal justice system in an era of declining trust in institutions and increasing polarization. For Michael's family, the search for truth and justice continues. They have vowed to pursue every legal avenue available to them, including the civil lawsuit against Melody and the bars where she had been drinking. They have also called for a new investigation into Michael's death, arguing that the original investigation was flawed and incomplete. For Melody, the legal battle may be over, but the personal battle continues. She faces ongoing civil litigation and the challenge of rebuilding her life in the shadow of a case that made her a household name. She has maintained her innocence and expressed hope that someday the truth about what happened that night will be revealed. The case has also prompted broader discussions about police accountability, the investigation of crimes involving law enforcement officers, and the need for reform in how such cases are handled. Some have called for the appointment of special prosecutors to handle cases involving police officers, while others have suggested the need for independent oversight bodies to review investigations. Today, Millbrook remains a community forever changed by the events of that January night. Michael Castellano's name is remembered on a memorial plaque outside the police station, and his family continues to honor his memory through charitable work and advocacy for victims' rights. The case serves as a reminder that justice is not always clear-cut, that truth can be elusive, and that the criminal justice system, while imperfect, remains our best hope for accountability and fairness. It also reminds us that behind every criminal case are real people, victims, defendants, families, and communities, whose lives are forever altered by violence and tragedy. As the legal proceedings continue and the community continues to heal, one question remains. Will we ever know the complete truth about what happened to Michael Castellano that snowy night in January? Perhaps not. But in the search for truth and justice, we are reminded of the importance of thorough investigation, fair trials, and the presumption of innocence that forms the foundation of our legal system. The case of Michael Castellano and Melody Sinclair, will be remembered as one of the most controversial and emotionally charged criminal cases in Connecticut's recent history. It will be studied by legal scholars, debated by true crime enthusiasts, and remembered by a community that was forced to confront difficult questions about justice, truth, and the complexity of human nature. In the end, perhaps the most important lesson from this case is the reminder that every victim deserves justice, every defendant deserves a fair trial, and every community deserves the truth. The search for these ideals continues, one case at a time, one investigation at a time, one jury at a time. And in that search, we find not just the hope for justice, but the foundation of a society that strives to treat all people with dignity and fairness, regardless of their position or circumstances. The snow has long since melted from Maple Ridge Drive, but the memory of what happened there that January night remains frozen in time, a reminder of a life lost, a community divided, and a justice system tested. Whether that system ultimately succeeded or failed may depend on your perspective, but one thing is certain: the case of Michael Castellano will not be forgotten, and the search for truth will continue.